Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a fascinating and honestly really dark chapter of the 20th century. We're going to break down the stark contrast between the grandiose, theoretical promises of Italian fascism and the incredibly brutal, chaotic reality of how it actually played out in history. We'll be digging directly into primary source texts and historical records to figure out how an ideology that promised absolute strength and unity ultimately collapsed into total dependence and civil war. To make sense of this massive shift, we'll follow a six-part agenda. 1. The doctrine of fascism. 2. Rejecting democracy and peace. 3. Fall and German rescue. 4. The Republic of Salo. 5. Italy's brutal civil war. And finally, 6. Collapse and lasting legacy. So, Section 1, the doctrine of fascism. Because, to understand the collapse, we really have to understand the initial promise. Right off the bat, looking at the very first page of Mussolini's 1932 Doctrine of Fascism, we see this ideology defined as way more than just a system of government or a set of laws. Actually, Mussolini frames it as this organic, all-encompassing spiritual attitude. The text argues that to truly know mankind, you have to be acquainted with reality and its laws, and it demands an active, almost religious commitment to the nation above any selfish, everyday pleasures. Think about what that actually means for a second. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist. This brilliantly illustrates the absolute core tenet of the whole ideology: total state supremacy. Under this doctrine, you, the individual, only matter, you literally only have value, if your interests align perfectly with the state. The state isn't just a government, it's viewed as a living, breathing entity that creates the nation, not the other way around. And because of that, the doctrine firmly and explicitly rejected individualism. It set itself up as the ultimate enemy of classical liberalism, which it claims selfishly put the individual over the state, and socialism, which it criticized for focusing entirely on class struggle. Under fascism, there were going to be no individuals, no independent political parties, no unions operating outside the watchful eye of the state. It demanded total, unbroken unity. Section 2, rejecting democracy and peace. Moving on, let's look at how this highly centralized mindset viewed conflict and global governance. When addressing the future of mankind, the text didn't pull any punches. It explicitly rejected majority-rule democracy. The argument was basically that a nation shouldn't be governed just by numbers or periodic elections. And perpetual peace? Completely dismissed. In fact, they branded pacifism as a cloak for cowardly renunciation. So the crucial takeaway here is that violence and war weren't just political tools for Mussolini, they were glorified as the ultimate virtues. The ideology claimed that struggle was absolutely essential to the fascist identity, that war tested a nation and literally elevated it above others. Peace wasn't the goal. Peace was viewed as a symptom of weakness and decadence. Inactivity is death. It's a sweeping, dramatic claim, right? But it meant the state had to constantly expand and assert its power, just to prove its vitality. Imperialism wasn't presented as just a policy option. It was a do-or-die necessity. Expand or die. That was the mindset. Section 3, Fall and German Rescue. Now, we are pivoting sharply from that glorious, invincible theoretical language of the 30s to the gritty, chaotic reality of 1943. Here is the massive reality check we're analyzing today. On one side, you have Mussolini's 1932 promise of a fiercely independent, imperial nation wielding absolute power. On the other side, the grim reality of 1943. Italy is fractured, its military humiliated after devastating defeats in North Africa and Russia, and Mussolini himself is now presiding over a puppet state, completely micromanaged by Nazi Germany. The gap between theory and reality here is just staggering. Let's trace exactly how fast this collapsed. Following the Allied invasion of Sicily, the Grand Council of Fascism actually voted no confidence in Mussolini in July 1943, and the king had him arrested. By September, Italy signs an armistice with the Allies. Anticipating this, German forces swiftly occupy northern and central Italy. Then, in a genuinely movie-like turn of events, German paratroopers execute Operation Eiche, a daring glider raid on a mountaintop ski resort just to break Mussolini out of prison. Days later, under intense pressure from Hitler, a brand new fascist government is announced. Section 4, the Republic of Salo. Hitler basically forced a reluctant Mussolini back into power under the threat of destroying major Italian cities, leading to this desperate new government. Formally, This new setup was called the Italian Social Republic, or RSI. Now, it boldly claimed authority over all Italy and called Rome its capital. But reality? It operated out of a tiny lakeside town called Salo, hence the nickname, the Republic of Salo. It was a mere shadow of its former glory. German advisors hovered over literally every decision, with SS and Wehrmacht commanders routinely overruling Italian officials. They tried pushing radical economic policies to win back the workers, but under Nazi occupation, those promises were completely empty. And get this number tells you everything you need to know about how the Italian people felt about this new state. Despite all those grand ideological claims of military strength, only about 40% of conscripted Italian youth actually showed up when drafted for the RSI's new army. And of those who did show up, a lot of them deserted almost immediately. That glorious warfare promised back in 1932 had entirely lost its appeal. Section 5. Italy's brutal civil war. This massive lack of support for the new fascist army was directly tied to the fact that northern Italy had erupted into a devastating conflict, tearing society apart from the inside. Let's look at the diverse factions warring in the streets and mountains. It was a total fracturing of a nation. On the Axis side, you had the regular army, the Republican National Guard, the ruthless Black Brigades hunting down resistance fighters, and elite units. Facing them was a highly varied partisan resistance. Communists, Catholics, monarchists, and disbanded soldiers who fled to the mountains to avoid German concentration camps. Neighbors were literally turning against neighbors. 250,000. That staggering number represents the size of the armed partisan resistance by April 1945. What started out as small, scattered bands of disbanded soldiers grew into a massive guerrilla army, actively sabotaging infrastructure, gathering intel for the Allies, and fighting brutal skirmishes across the entire region. And what's absolutely crucial to understand is that the partisans were essentially fighting three intertwined wars all at once. First, a civil war against their fellow Italians and the fascist militias. Second, a liberation war to kick out the German occupiers. And third, especially for the communist factions, a class war against the ruling elites. The human cost was profound. German and fascist forces routinely wiped out entire villages suspected of harboring partisans, leaving a horrific trail of devastation. Section 6. Collapse and Lasting Legacy. By the spring of 1945, the illusion of the Italian Social Republic, and really the decades-old promises of the fascist doctrine, were completely shattered. So, stripped of German military protection as Nazi troops retreated towards Austria, the puppet state rapidly collapsed. Partisan groups swept in, seizing major industrial cities like Milan and Turin. Mussolini, knowing the end was here, actually tried to flee to Switzerland, hidden in a German convoy, disguised in a Luftwaffe helmet and overcoat. But it didn't work. He was recognized, captured by communist partisans near Lake Como, and executed on April 28, 1945. His body was put on public display in Milan, a brutal, unceremonious end to a regime that once promised an eternal empire. The fall of fascism wasn't just a clean break either. The scars from those brutal 20 months of civil war fundamentally shaped Italy's post-war identity. The nation emerged deeply divided politically between the left and the right, wrestling with really painful, unresolved memories about who resisted and who collaborated. But, importantly, those very traumas directly influenced the formation of Italy's new democratic constitution, which was specifically engineered with strict checks and balances to firmly reject any return to authoritarian rule. It leaves us with a really heavy question. How do the scars of a civil war, fueled by extreme ideology, continue to shape a nation's democratic identity decades later? The transition from the grand absolute promises of 1932 to the tragic fractured reality of 1945 reminds us of the profound human cost of ideological extremism. I'll leave you to ponder that as we wrap up our explainer today. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the source material, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world.